Okay, welcome back. It seems like we haven't lost too many people during lunch, and a few people are still eating, I think. My name is John Jones. I'm sorry to say I'm another white European face.
That's not what I meant, though.
If it could be a help, I was born in India and raised in Trinidad, but live in Norway now. Okay, and I don't do it. So, before we go on to the panel, I think we should watch a reading from Zambia, from Kenneth Kaunda, and if everything works, then we can listen to it.
To you, my friends, gathered in London, from Lusaka, Zambia, I send you greetings. It is gratifying that you have gathered to reflect on Africa's journey over the past 60 years. Besides UK, others have this year been gathering in Ghana and other places. We need reflections all over Africa and the diaspora. We need them now and at other times. "60 years since the AAPC meeting, it is now an important time to reflect on the AAPC initial conference that some of us attended in Accra, Ghana. Indeed, Africa is in your heart. The December 1958 conference was very significant for Africa. We considered Africa as one. We left Ghana very inspired and refreshed. Though from various backgrounds, we worked together. AAPC 1958 helped us to achieve independence and freedom in Africa. In Africa. Friends, for the future of Africa and this our one world, it is important that we are always reflecting and learning from our experiences. At your gathering today, you will consider many subjects. You will consider those of us who were there in 1958 and ask questions about what we did or did not do. And what we achieved and did not achieve in the various areas of human endeavor. What factors local and external were present at that time. I emphasize the point, what factors local and external were present at that time. We must consider where we are now and where we are going. We should learn the lessons and together find ways of improving things. I emphasize the point, we should learn the lessons and together find ways of improving things. We shall be grateful to learn from your views. Over the 60 years, there have been key lessons and we have much learning. Overall, working together, we made many gains and there were some challenges we faced. Some challenges were from local causes, while others came from external interests and causes. My friends, as can be witnessed by your gathering, the spirit of Pan Africanism is still very much alive. Let us remember our strength. Let us remember the challenges that have really affected us. Let us work together. Remember that Africa and the whole world will progress when we love our neighbor as ourselves. We must do unto others as we would have them do unto us. My friends, let's remember that besides arising from various backgrounds, we are in essence brothers and sisters. Brothers and sisters. East, west, and north, south, we belong to the same human family. Together, we must live and work. Let us reflect and work together for a better Africa and better world. My brothers and sisters, my friends, I feel humbled and thank the Lord God Almighty that 60 years after AAPC 1958, I am with you as a witness of this journey of Africa. From Lusaka, I wish you fruitful deliberations. Thank you.
Okay, recorded 2 days ago in Lusaka in Kaunda's house. 94 years old now, and I'm grateful for this wonderful message from him. I'd invite the group to come up here. We'll do some presentations. So for this session, we've had a wonderful first session, and welcome back to this one. Zalda Masood is King's College London person, and he will take us into his ideas of looking back at the conference in '58. In addition to Salam, we have from the first session, Cameron Dudu,
Thank you.
And a Ghanaian, and a wonderful fellow journalist who's actually present, is the third face present in '58. Wonderful. Much younger than being able to.
Wow.
You can't have been there in '58, can you?
Fossilized.
Fossilized. So that'll be a message on the fossils. Leo Zelig, the third one. We're looking forward to listening to his words on Frantz Fanon. A wonderful voice, and together I think we'll have a wonderful session. So I'll leave the computer, and I want you to start, okay? Since you're there with the technical. Have you managed to?
Yeah.
Hello, is this working? Yeah. Sorry, I'm another white face from Africa. This one? Yeah, just like that. I'm going to talk, it'd be nice to talk about North Africa and Pan Africanism. We talk about Pan Africanism, but very rarely actually the connection with North Africa comes up, especially these days. There are very good reasons for it. There are lots of contradictions, both in North Africa itself, especially in North Africa itself, but also in the rest of Africa. And to a large extent also the way that Africa is seen from the rest of the world, and who's doing the narrative, in a way. So, sorry, yes. So before I do that, I think it's good to see how North Africa links up with Pan-Africanism and Africa in many ways, but it's a long, long story, so I'm going to be very succinct in it, and I apologize, and I don't know how much time do I have?
About 20 minutes.
20 minutes, yeah, okay. And I may jump from one thing to another, because, okay. As I said, it's a long story, and I may sort of just throw things at you, and hopefully we can discuss them afterwards. So let's go back a little, and of course, as you all know, the beginnings are always the same. This is where it starts, Africa. What constitutes Africa? North Africa, Southern Africa, etc. Yes, the word Africa comes from the north of the continent. In fact, this slogan that you've all heard, Africa for the Africans, was pronounced in the 3rd century BC by the greatest king of the north, at least the northern part of Africa, King Haile Massinissa of Numidia, which is what corresponds today to much of Algeria and towards the east, touching on Tunisia, obviously, and Morocco. This was cited by Livy, and who spoke much later, so we don't have the exact date when he pronounced it. But just something to notice about this, because everybody was talking about where does the word Africa come from, and what does it involve, what does it include, etc. At the time when Livy was speaking, or writing rather, the continent of Africa was just the north from the point of view of Europe, obviously, discovered. And that whole coast of Africa was at first referred to as Libya. And then later, during the Carthaginian times and during the Roman Empire, much of it was referred to as, the word Africa was confined to what is today Tunisia, the former territory of Carthage. So west of Tunisia, half of Algeria was Numidia, where Massinissa came from or was reigning over, and then the eastern part was Mauritania, divided in two by the Romans. Mauritania, Caesarea. Caesar was the capital east of Algiers, west of Algiers, and then Mauritania, Tingitania, which refers to Tangier in Morocco today. So therefore, the word Mauritania and Moors, which came up in the Middle Ages, sort of still refer to that. But what is interesting is that, in spite of all the divisions, when Massinissa was supposed to have said this, the idea that Africa was just that part of Africa known today as Tunisia is actually erroneous, because he is the king of Numidia. He doesn't say Numidia belongs to the Numidians. He said Africa to the Africans, which means there was already a concept that the entire, well, northern part of Africa was Africa. In a way, it was synonymous with what the Greeks called Libya. So, however, today, when we talk about Africa, we're speaking about the entire continent, and many of you, especially in Britain, the United States, in the Anglo-Saxon scholarship and everything, when people talk about about Africa, most people refer to sub-Saharan, as we call it now. We all laughed this morning when somebody mentioned the Black Africa from the French, but actually this was used by everybody until for a very long, long time. And this notion that North Africa does not belong in the rest of Africa is quite recent. And in fact, until the mid-20th century, when people referred to Africa, they started by talking about Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia and Libya. Egypt was Egypt, and then from Libya to Morocco, that was Africa. And then afterwards, it was just Africa divided. It just happened that the north belonged mostly to the French, and the rest was divided between the French and the north and the things. But this became an ideological thing later, especially in the 60s and 70s. In the 60s and 70s, but not because North Africans decided it or even the rest of Africa decided it, it came from the outside. But now we therefore look at, I want to go straight into Pan-Africanism. Is this Pan-Africanism there, was it a notion that applied to everyone? Was it Pan-Africanism for the whole of Africa, or just, and we all know that we've seen it this morning a bit, the origins of Pan-Africanism. Sometimes it takes its roots in the fight against slavery, and it was almost entirely started by the diaspora rather than the Africans at first. And we know the work of Marcus Garvey, but also William Bernard Du Bois, who put it into more sociology. He was a sociologist, and he put it into a scientific grounding. And he was an extraordinary man, and as was said earlier, I dug out some of his audio recordings from the Library of Congress 30 years ago, and he sounded as though he was speaking today. It was things. But he referred to, as was mentioned earlier, about Negro peoples. The Negro, as they said at the time, the Negro was the African, or the person of African descent, or people of African descent, which is much more ambiguous, obviously. So, when we look at the concept itself, the Pan-African Conference of London 1900, which was started in a way the more political, ideological and sociological concept, this was, it said, at the final communique, which was called an address to the nations of the world. Sorry, the world, obviously. Forgive the typo. The Congress of Men and Women of African Blood, meaning this conference gathered. This Congress, it's a Congress of men and women of African blood, united here to deliberate upon the present situation and outlook of the darker race of man. And then it practically ended with this sentence: the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the colour line. So that started in the early 20th century. We're talking already about the colour line in general, but that was almost imported to Africa as well. And it's the same thing. The Pan-African Congress of Paris in 1919, in its resolutions of the Allied and Associated Powers, it was just after the First World War, and that was again when the world was being divided into protectorate, etc., that the Allied and associated powers establish a code of law for the international protection of the natives of Africa. Still ambiguous. The Negroes of the world demand that hereafter the natives of Africa and the people of African descent, and then here it's less ambiguous because it's the Negroes of the world and African descent. So we can see that when we're referring to Africanism or Pan Africanism, we're talking about, as they said at the time, the Negro or black people, whichever the politically correct term of the time was. And all the 7 following Pan-African Congresses basically were based on that. It was based on, it was defending or addressing or questioning or defending people of color, people of African descent. Sorry, there's a mistake here, people of color again. And these are, whether they're in Africa or the Americas or the Caribbean, everywhere in the diaspora, outside the Caribbean, the Americas and Africa, i.e. Europe for instance, though Africanness or Africanity was therefore still defined by the colour of the skin. Again, we arrive in Accra, and this was totally different. The All African People's Conference of Accra 1958 broke new ground. It basically broke away from this. And Kwame Nkrumah went beyond the colour line and extended African national identity to all people in Africa. As I said, increased African agency. This is just my own way of saying it. That means the African had to decide for him or herself its future. It's about self-determination of the individual and the group in a way. And then introduced the concept of struggle for freedom against imperialism. But as you all know, this little book perhaps, the Short History or Political Guide of Pan-Africanism by Legum, he said that Pan-Africanism under Nkrumah evolved from past assumptions of a racially exclusive movement associated with Black Africa and adopted a political discourse of regional unity. And I think Legum put it very well. That is why to North Africans and to everyone else perhaps, the Accra Conference was very important. I wouldn't say far more important than everything because it would not have existed without the Pan-African Congresses, as it was said earlier, all the 7 ones, and the 1900 conference. But this was different. And there are reasons for it. It was a time of unity, not just of Africans, but it was a time when people were struggling towards anti-imperialism, decolonization, the unity of African nations, and solidarity among peoples, not just African people, but others elsewhere, who were the object and subject or whatever of anti-imperialism, of imperialism rather, and colonialism. So anti-imperialism and decolonization at the time was basically solidarity, writ large as I call it. It involved Asian nations, it involved Islamic states, Arab states, social nations, the USSR also, the Soviet bloc in general, and China. So, before the conference, and Nkrumah attended it, was the Bandung Conference. You see that I spell it O-E-N-G, which was the Dutch spelling at the time, and then I come back to the normal Indonesian pronunciation of U-N-G. It was African and Asian nations, and I think it served it played a very important psychological and ideological thing. And Kwame Nkrumah himself, although he was not created at the Bandung Conference, but probably acquired a lot of ethics. His status grew, and his ideology then probably exploded and went beyond the past history of Pan-Africanism. The fact that he was there with Asians, most of them, or many of course, most of them have just been liberated. There was China, they were living in the USSR with its revolution, and then from Africa, not many people obviously, not many countries, but Algeria was at the time fighting, talking about North Africa now. Libya and Egypt were the only Northern African countries which were independent at the time. And Libya was went there, but it was not as active as Egypt, for instance. Morocco and Tunisia were still not independent at the Bandung Conference in 1955. They both acquired their independence in 1956. So the FLN, the National Liberation Front of Algeria, saw its chance to internationalize its cause, the cause of the liberation of Algeria, for the independence of Algeria, but also to internationalize it, but also to acquire support in every sense. However, the FLN at the time was basically almost, it came under control of Egypt, because some of the members of the FLN were staying in Cairo for all sorts of historic reasons, because there were nowhere else they could go in 1954 when the FLN was created. They could not go anywhere in Africa because most of Africa was still not independent, and therefore they went to Egypt, which is the closest country, and also Gamal Abdel Nasser had just seized power in Egypt, and he was doing all those policies, the Third World, and he was one of the main participants with Nkrumah, with Sukarno, with Nehru, and Tito, obviously. He wanted to go there and represent Algeria. And then the representatives, in fact, wanted one of the established political parties. And finally, the FLN went to Nasser and imposed themselves, and the other party actually deferred to them. The reason for that, and we can see it earlier, Nasser basically wanted to cannibalize the North African liberation movement from Libya to a point that it was independent, but Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. And they didn't see it that way. And this will play an important part later, all the way towards the 60s and 70s, basically, towards the end of the realm of Nasser, basically. And North Africa made inroads at Bandung. Gamal Abdel Nasser, as I just said, who wanted control over Algeria, was put aside in a way, and the FLN imposed itself, promoted the cause, and it went into the conference from the back door, basically, as part of the Egyptian delegation. They didn't have status. Once the conference was finished, the FLN was a full representative of Algeria, and it was part of the non-aligned movement as a member of the African group. Oh gosh, I've just started. Anyway, so this is how it started, and in fact, as I said, it increased its international status, but Nkrumah learned from that too, in a way, and that's why the FLN was invited. So there was a continuity there. When at the end of the conference it upheld the Bandung platform, but then Pan-Africanism went beyond, as I said, black people's liberation of things. I'm just going to apparently I thought I had more than that. And then Fanon. I'm not going to go into Fanon, but the Fanon dimension was very important. Fanon was one of the, he was heart and soul with the FLN. He became an Algerian, and he was one of the main advisors. Okay, what was then, in fact, the following is that the three conferences that followed Accra, one was in Tunisia, the other one was in Cairo, which means North Africa actually played an important part, in fact, in Pan-Africanism. The fourth one was going to take place in Algeria, but there were all sorts of problems within the... Can I have a few minutes more? Just 5 minutes? All right, thanks. Yeah. And it was postponed, and then finally, Bembela, who was the champion of Pan-Africanism at the time, was toppled, replaced by Boumediene, who promised to continue it, but it was cancelled. And only one thing was left of it, a pack of cigarettes. It was named for the conference to commemorate it, but then the conference didn't take place, the pack of the cigarettes stayed. And stayed. Even you can see the second Afro-Asiatic conference. It was going to never did. They got rid of the second afterwards. And so the biggest act of Pan-Africanism in 1967, Boumediene went all the way because of the Palestinian thing, because of the Arab cause. He found himself a new identity, which is Pan-Arabism, and this Pan-Arabism then sidelined Africa, basically. But the only thing that remained was as I said, the Algiers was actually at the time between 64 and 62 and 68. It was the capital of Africa. It was the capital of world liberation. All the African liberation movements were represented there. It was their headquarters. And then afterwards, it was basically what Algeria became one of the frontline states with Syria and things fighting Israel instead. But one thing was done in 1969, and this, I draw your attention for those who don't know about it. It's mentioned from time to time. The Pan-African Cultural Festival in Algiers in July 1969. This was, at least to me, at least as important as the 1958 conference. Some would say even more so, because the 1958 conference was a conference of politics. It was politicians, it was even intellectuals, they were politicized. In Algiers in 1969, this was, I mentioned Mariam Makeba earlier, but it was everything that Africa had of good, beautiful, intellectual, political, etc. And people of African descent. You have from the liberation movements of the United States, they call themselves the Black Panthers, for instance, from the Caribbeans represented George Cleaver at the time. He was using it as his things, but there's a great film about that, but it's not available. But anyway, if you can lay your hands on it, you can see this was the second greatest moment, in my opinion. It was called the Pan African Cultural Festival. So the OAU then, Algeria at the beginning, financed it, played a part in it, but then it just became, as I said, an open ring for high stakes among the North African nations with Western Sahara, etc. And then after 1972, then the North African countries were playing the part of the game with the Middle East rather than Africa. And so the contradiction then would be North Africans, the peoples weren't quite sure, the governments were playing both games, Arab, Africa, Middle East, Africa, and then of course this was the main contradiction among them, Berber, Arab. The North Africans are not Arabs, but they've been Arabized, mainly by the French in the 19th century, but this was the official ideology of all the North African governments. And therefore, this was used, and the closer to the Arab bloc you become, the more you can establish the Arab identity, and then you do it also by Islam, and you promote it, and you know from Boko Haram to Acme, or the Al-Qaeda, etc., what this policy led to. I'm sorry, I don't have much time to go into it, but we can talk about it later. Algeria played still a part, mediation in the Sahel with the Mali and Niger thing, the admission of the Saharan Republic and the OAU. Morocco withdraws from the OAU, as you know, and at the same time applies to join the European Union. So the dichotomy is still all over the place. Middle East, Europe, North Africa, and like Libya, you all know what Libya was doing in Africa in many ways. It played an enormous part politically in terms of creating the African Union, for instance, but is it really commitment, or is it detachment, or is it mostly, as people accuse them, hegemony? Morocco came back, obviously, back in the fold now. And at the moment, Morocco is probably the country of North Africa which mostly invested in every sense in Africa, economically at least. Algeria politically, because it's still at it plays an important part of the EU, but from the diplomatic and political point of view, and also gives free military aid to Niger and other places. Morocco is the country which is investing in many ways. So the regional integration was part of the North African project also. North Africa integrating with West Africa. And talked about one of the big things is the Trans-Saharan Highway, which was supposed to go from Algiers to Lagos. It's still not built. It started, the project itself was proposed in 1960-61, and nothing happened. Algeria started building it, but none of the other countries did anything, especially Mali and Niger and Chad. And then it resuscitated in the 1970s, but it's supposed to open in 2018 now. It's still not open. So this is the Lagos thing. And when you think of African integration, these were the trade routes in the 15th century. You can see the difference, in fact, of all these things. And we can, it's a sad thing to look at, but anyway. So, as I said, go compare, you remember the thing. So North African reintegration, I think I'm finishing now. Again, what is North African reintegration? We have this thing called Fortress Europe. It's not just North Africa. I was working with the European Union mission in West Africa until a couple of years ago. And one of the things that Europe was trying to do, I went to meetings with Frontex, the European border agency in Warsaw, with a bunch of colleagues from Niger and other African countries. And what they wanted to do was basically, instead of looking at Schengen, for instance, they're looking at, we have Frontex, we build a border around Europe, we protect it, why don't we do this in West Africa? I really had to, I was never invited after that, because instead of being a member of the European delegation, I was speaking for the Africans. And I said, well, the ECOWAS had a strategy of regional integration, almost like Schengen in many ways in terms of economic integration, in terms of circulation of goods and populations. And they are trying to create a Frontex of Africa. That means reinforce the borders. That is, basically jeopardize and frustrate the African strategy. It was so you could understand why I was never invited after that. And the monetary union of West Africa, the same thing. In fact, anyway, they were also trying to open it, and they had this pressure from the thing. So they were quite happy when I was there to speak like them, even though, as I said, I'm speaking with a passport, a European passport here, but I'm speaking with my heart in that sense. Sorry about the white face. These emerging states in Africa, like Nigeria, these are potentials which are still being not explored in a way, not really exploited, and there is still a lot of it. So when we're talking about North African integration, but do we have one Africa, the rainbow things? I'll probably stop there, thanks. So this is the one I'm looking at, and this is the one I want. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for opening up to the rest of Africa, but also connecting to Bandung, which I think is the first time we mentioned today, and you can go back to the panel later today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Your title is very wide, so I'm really looking forward to your animal.
Greetings from Ghana. If you want to understand why the AAPC is important, you've got to go back to March 1957, 6th of March 1957. I was a young reporter, and I was at the Accra Polo Ground, and I saw for the first time in my life a crowd of about 250,000 people. And they all stood there. It is on YouTube, so if I'm lying, you can check it. And Kwame Nkrumah stood there before us and said, "At long last, the battle is over, and Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." I remember it from then. And the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the whole African continent. And the people, like one person said, "Yeah!" It lasted for about 10 minutes. The euphoria that was created in Accra on 6th of March 1957 was carried forward to April 1958, when, against great odds, against a lot of suspicions, Nkrumah was able to assemble all the independent African states in Accra for a conference. Now, when the liberation movements in Africa heard that all the independent African states were going to meet in Accra, they of course made inroads to come and lobby for assistance and other things. And that conference then gave birth to the idea that there should be an all-African people's conference, not independent states, but peoples. So this was open to all liberation movements on the continent. I was fortunate to be invited to the Soviet Union in September 1958. And there, on the delegation, I was a member of the Ghana Writers Association, and I was a delegate to a conference that took place at Tashkent, Afro-Asian Writers Conference. There I met for the first time in my life Africans from developing, dependent countries. Angola, Senegal, and so on. We used to sit around and chat. And it began to dawn on me that I came there with a Ghana passport. And they were coming with French passports. And the Portuguese people who came from Angola, they came from Frankfurt. And this contradiction began to hit me. We didn't fire one shot, and we are independent. I came here with a Ghanaian passport. And these people can't even live near their own birthplace because the Portuguese will come and kill them. So when I returned to Ghana, I was then a reporter at the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation. And I heard that there was going to be a conference of people from dependent African countries. My head just blew up, as it were. Oh, so we're going to help my friends to achieve independence themselves. And they came to Accra through all manner of subterfuges. Marika has told you about the role that George Padmore was playing. He came to Accra with this huge address book, and he was in touch with everybody. And when they came, at that time, the greatest, most heroic figure in Africa, Nkrumah not excluded, was Jomo Kenyatta. All African people's minds were tuned towards worshipping this man who had said, no, you will not have white highlands in Kenya. And whose people had been caught and brutalized, and himself sentenced to 7 years imprisonment for basically doing nothing and refusing to tell the British the name of his resistance movement, which they then christened themselves as Mau Mau. Now, there is no language in Kenya that gives any meaning to Mau Mau. It is unknown. The British invented it. And yet, they threw out the White Highlands. So when Tom Mboya came to Ghana in 1958, he wasn't riding his own horse. It was Jomo Kenyatta's reflected glory that gave him that job of being the chair of the conference. But then he proved equal to the task, because that phrase he coined. The Europeans came to scramble for Africa in 1884. This is the time that we're telling them to scram from Africa. That word scram, it was, I think, basically American. And you know how good Americans are with catchy phrases. Everybody accepted it, and he built upon that. I think, myself, looking back, that the AAPC was the most important gathering of Africans and people of African descent ever to have taken place on this planet, and probably because within 4 years, almost all the French territories, about 30 of them, were independent. Within 5 years, the OAU was formed. Organization of African Unity, and you've heard about how difficult it was. Nkrumah nearly walked out, but it was formed. And it hasn't done too great a job, but it is there. It's now the African Union. That means the steps are there. They can be used to climb up, and and achieve greater events. I also coined the phrase that Ghana's independence in 1957 was like an injection of adrenaline into the bloodstream of the whole continent. The adrenaline lasted a long time. Mistakes have been made because we are all human. And anyone who dares to ask whether African independence was worth it has to ask himself or herself, do the Europeans deserve independence? They killed 20 million people in World War I. They killed 40 million people in World War II. They have killed more people in Africa and other areas, not being their territories, out of sheer lust for goods and power. Yet they are independent. Africans have become independent. They produce somebody like Idi Amin or Bokassa, and therefore they are not worth giving independence to. Okay, Bokassa killed how many people? How many people did Idi Amin kill? Okay, there was Rwanda. Terrible. But after Rwanda, did we not have Bosnia? So we have to be careful to think straight and not allow ourselves to be diverted by racism and other things into underwriting our own history. Human rights are not negotiable. We had the right to manage or mismanage our own affairs like everybody else. And the AAPC was a major weapon that has been used and will continue to be used by Africans to try and entrench their human rights like everybody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a powerful message. Thank you. You pronounce the name Selig? Zilik. Okay. On Frantz Fanon.
I certainly have the worst shift, I think, in this conference, speaking after camera. So you'll have to forgive me. Whatever I say will be a come down. But anyway, I'm hoping that I can give some clarity about the role of Frantz Fanon, the role that he played at the conference in 1958. I think for Fanon, the All African People's Conference was a place of both extraordinary and ebullient freedom and liberation, and it also contained some contradictions for him. It offered a base, an advanced guard of African liberation, and also some of its entanglements. Who was Frantz Fanon? We already, most of us, know who he was. A Martinican by birth, who had trained as a doctor, a medical doctor, and then a psychiatrist in France, scarred by and disgusted by the war, where he had fought with de Gaulle's Free French, horrified, outraged by the racism and the apartheid system that had operated in the French army. Moves in 1953 to French Algeria and to work as a psychiatrist in Blida, which is just outside Algiers, and very quickly attaches himself to the Algerian Revolution in 1954 and becomes a fearsome fighter for Algerian and then African liberation. So what I want to do quite briefly is to look at Fanon's intervention in the December conference. Ghana was where Fanon would go on to be the ambassador of the provisional government of the Algerian Republic in 1960, but he had visited it many times before. And the debates that took place there, essentially the ones over liberation, national struggle and violence, were ones that he played a key role in. Again and again, Fanon, from 1958 on, had become an opponent to what he described as the vacuous and empty sloganizing of some aspects of national liberation. And he pushed against what he saw as and described in 1960 as the absence of ideology, the failure of a set of ideas that could promote and further extend African liberation, to make something of Pan Africanism as a real vehicle for transformation and liberation. One of the ways that he did this, and he certainly wasn't alone in it, was in his advocacy of the African Legion, a force that would push for real continental unity in its actual fights, its bread and butter liberation in the late 50s and early 60s. So Accra was an incredibly important staging post for Fanon's own development. And to some extent, it was a reaction, as we've just powerfully heard, to both Ghana's extraordinary and historic injection of adrenaline into the veins of the continent's liberation with the country's independence in '57. And to some extent, the conference was also a response to the Conference of Independent States that had taken place earlier in 1957, which called for the defeat of the Europeans, but also refused to give full support for the armed struggle and urged France to negotiate, in the case of the Algerian liberation struggle, with the FLN and the ALN, the armed wing. And at this point, the high point really in the struggle for national liberation and liberatory freedom in Algeria was the Battle of Algiers, which had raged from '57 through '58. And it was an attempt to bring the experience of that liberation war that the Algerian delegation, which Fanon was a member in '58, made. So in December, Fanon had a significant influence on the attitude of the All-African People's Conference, shifting the focus and winning support for violence and the necessity of violence and armed struggle. He spoke on the 8th of December, and it's worth citing his extraordinary contribution. And he said, "If Africa is awakening, it must not make apologies or entreaties. No African must regard himself as demobilized from the struggle so long as any foreign nation dominates any part of Africa. All forms of struggle must be adopted, not excluding violence." The delegates were transfixed. One South African writer described, "Dr. Fanon Omar of Algeria is certainly the highlight of the session. He does not mince words. What FLN man can afford the luxury anyway? Algerians have no other recourse but fight back," he says, "and the FLN means to go through with it." In staccato French, he carries the audience to the horrible scenes of French atrocities on Algerians. He gets the loudest and longest ovation of all speakers. And in the subcommittees afterwards, it's clear that this contribution wasn't simply at the level of speeches from the podium, but also an argument for the necessity of violence in the liberation of the continent, of armed struggle in the liberation of the continent. Fanon said that a violent riposte to colonial brutality across the continent was necessary, and while perhaps we can maintain, he argued, some commitment to non-violence, it must not be given the privileged position. Fanon's argument also was that France's defeat in some colonies, obviously Indochina, Vietnam, as well as Morocco and Tunisia, had forced it to allow peaceful decolonization elsewhere. So to some extent, he was saying that the forces of national liberation on the continent also owed Algeria a direct debt and solidarity. The Algerian Revolution, therefore, he argued, was the storm bird, the real liberation, as he describes it, of the continental revolution. So Fanon, I think, in the conference was doing two things which was even far-sighted in those extraordinary days. Firstly, he was stating that Algeria, as we've heard, was intimately part of the continent, south of the Sahara, and it had always been. And for Fanon, fraternity in the struggle against imperialism was what really mattered. The December conference took a bold step forward away from these hesitant resolutions of non-violence and peaceful means that we'd seen earlier in the year. And it marked, I think, a very powerful moment in Pan-African radical jubilation. The battle cry was no longer simply non-violence, but also the counter-violence of the oppressed, an argument that was made again and again through the conference and its subcommittees by Fanon and the Algerian delegation. The effect was dramatic. Fanon had, with little exaggeration, dominated and won the arguments for armed and violent struggle, and was becoming famously and developing, to some extent his ideas developed in the context of Ghana, the famous and militant exponent of the politics of African unity and liberation. Algeria's violent war for liberation, he believed, was the high point of the continent's popular struggles for freedom. So there was a two-way process. The conference had been radicalized by Fanon's own contribution, and Fanon had been transformed by his experiences in Ghana, particularly, and across the continent. And it breathed life into his own developing notions of what Pan-Africanism meant, what it could really mean for the continent, and what its unity and what the continent's unity would look like. Forged by this experience, he was famous for his own frustration, the anger at how things were progressing slowly. Over the next 2 years, this frustration deepened. At a conference in the Ghana capital in 1960 on positive action for peace and security, the British academic Peter Worsley recorded his impressions of Fanon's speech and said, "I found myself electrified by a contribution that was remarkable, not only for its analytic power, but delivered too with a passion and brilliance that is all too rare." During the speech, Worsley reported that the presenter appeared to become overwhelmed, and he later spoke to Fanon, who explained that he had suddenly felt overwhelmed at the thought that he had to stand there before the assembled representatives of African national movements to try and persuade them that the Algerian cause was important at a time when men and women were dying and being tortured in his country for a cause whose justice ought to command automatic support from rational and progressive human beings. Now, this was typical of Fanon. The extraordinary power of his analysis, but wedded also to a frustration that he even had to make an argument. And perhaps also points to the complaint that he made on his West African mission to the south, through Mali, to the south of Algeria in 1960, where he laments the absence of ideology among Africa's new political class. So between these conferences, and it's no accident that it was between these conferences, Fanon writes his perhaps most understated and unread books, Anti-Colonialism, which was a celebration of the militancy, the re-cerebralization of Algerians in that wonderful medical lexicon that he would always employ. So the transformation of Algerians in the process of making their revolution against the French. But he also developed in this extraordinary book his own ideas on violence that he had started to form in 1958. The colonial regime, he says, is violence in its natural state, trapping the native and the colonized in a web of inferiority and submissiveness. So violence, non-violence, actually, it was extraordinarily dismissive about. Said it's a European ideology, it needs to be thrown out. But that violence is a necessary step in asserting humanity and demanding recognition in that very important case. So without a full or real liberation, the term that Fanon used through his work in the late 50s and early 60s and in his crowning book, The Wretched of the Earth, the possibility of liberation continuing after the nation was one, in some form, not always clearly expressed by Fanon, to fold over into human and economic transformation that would ultimately spread beyond the continent into a global process of human liberation. He saw independence becoming a bind, and that the national, and in some senses, limiting that possibility of real freedom, and that the national bourgeoisie, the caste of profiteers, who'd played a role in the independence movements, or were taking over, or usurping that possibility and that freedom. And he describes them as a sort of little caste, avid and voracious, only too glad to accept the dividends that the former colonial power hands to it. So while Fanon knew the terrible dangers, he did regard violence as a cleansing force. It freed in his words, the native of his inferiority complex, and from his despair and inaction, it makes him fearless and restores his self-respect. So one of the most extraordinary and unknown facts about Fanon's work on the continent was that in 1960 he undertakes a mission with a number of militant FLN, ALN advisors, a small group, through West Africa, through Guinea, Mali, and then to the south of French-occupied Algeria, as an attempt to develop what he'd long argued for, and I think first started making the arguments in 1958, an African Legion that can bring real military supplies to those countries on the continent, and solidarity, that are still fighting the European. And he makes this mission in November, December 1960, after having won limited, begrudging support from the provisional government, which is, as we've heard, was based in Egypt, in Cairo. And it's worth giving you some details about this. Fanon kept a field journal that he intended to use when he returned to write some sort of report for the FLN leadership about this journey and about the fact that it was possible. It had always happened through the history of the continent, the recent history of the continent, but here it could be mobilized once more as a way of transforming the Algerian, the prospects of the war against the French. And this field journal, these rough notes, which we've all kept at different times in our lives in very different experiences, is a remarkable document. He was almost incapable of writing a single word of prose which wasn't astonishing. And it accounts the difficult circumstances and this clandestine trip, 2,000-mile trip. And the journal starts with a series of bullet points, his objectives: to put Africa in motion, to cooperate in its organisation, in its regroupment, behind revolutionary principles, to participate in the ordered movement of the continent. This is the work that I had chosen. And then in another passage later on in these notes, we must immediately take the war to the enemy, leave him no rest, harass him, cut off his breath. Let's go. Our admission to open up the southern front, to bring it in arms and munitions from Bamako, stir up the populations of the Sahara, infiltrate our way into the high plains of Algeria. Having taken Algeria to the four corners of Africa, we have to go back with the whole of Africa to African Algeria, towards the north, towards the continental cities of Algiers. That is what I want. Great lives, cross the desert, wear out the desert, deny it, bring together Africa and create the continent. Take the absurd, the impossible, rub it up the wrong way and hurl a continent into the assault. As we can see, Fanon was modest in his objectives. Though, if these hopes and ambitions seem strange to us, perhaps they also express the weariness and pessimism of our own contemporary hopes. They were a group of 8 men, 2 soldiers, 2 signal experts, 2 political advisors and 2 medics. And they managed to make the trip and Fanon filed the report. However, he returned sick, and within weeks of returning, it was clear that something was wrong. He was tested positive for leukemia, and a year later died in an American hospital, a country that he didn't want to go to because of its notorious, as he said, lynch mobs and racists. 1958, like 1954, and the start of the Algerian Revolution, with the 1st of November insurrection, was a key moment both for the continent and for Fanon's own political development, learning from African liberation, but also trying to urge it on, force it to be more than itself, to breathe life into the slogans and to grasp the possibilities of what he regarded as real liberation.